I'll introduce you and you can get started, and if more people join in, that's terrific. So welcome everybody to another Envirothon webinar. Woohoo! We get to learn more today from Patrick Allison, Jr. From the East Quabbin Land Trust about benthic macroinvertebrates. Monday's presentation was thrilling and very exciting and involved lots of things with legs. And today I think we're lacking legs, but please join me in welcoming Patrick. And I bet I need to change one setting so that you can get your slides up. There you go.
Let's see. So can we see everything? Everything moving properly? Okay, cool. All right, so thank you very much for having me again. I'm very excited to be talking about my favorite critters today. So in the first part of this presentation series, I gave a basic introduction for freshwater macroinvertebrates, as well as aquatic insects and the biotic index that we use to examine water quality. If you're interested in that, please check out part 1. It's recorded and is on the Envirothon website. And part 2, we are going to be focusing on freshwater mussels and my specialty and favorite animals in the whole wide world, crayfishes. So let's get started with the freshwater mussels. And I am going to butcher this pronunciation. Unionoida are the freshwater mussels. And freshwater mussels are another ancient group, so like the insects that we were looking at before. Freshwater mussels invaded freshwater systems as early as the Triassic. And here we can see some fossil evidence of freshwater mussels. Now, most people think of mussels as living rocks, but there's much, much more to them. And yes, they do move. You can see in this picture down here, you've got this freshwater mussel that has made its way through the sand substrate down here. So let's dive into some more details. Let's first talk about anatomy. So some basic anatomy when it comes to freshwater mussels. We look at the top part of the freshwater mussel. This is known as the umbo or the beak. And on the inside portion, basically where it rounds up to here is where the umbo is. Next, we look at the teeth of the freshwater mussel. So when I say teeth, these are not used for chewing like you'd think for typical animals. Instead, the teeth of the freshwater mussel are used to help keep the freshwater mussel nice, tight, and closed. So the lateral teeth run, as the name suggests, laterally along the margin of the shell. And then we have what are known as pseudocardinal teeth that are right here. And these are going to be more shaped kind of like your molars or your canine teeth in your own mouth, while the lateral teeth are going to be more elongate in appearance. Now, when we look at the inside of a freshwater mussel shell and you flip open the entirety of the shell and look inside, you can see the lateral teeth are going to be right up here. And the pseudocardinal teeth are right here on the end. Now, the idea with these teeth, again, we want to keep our mussel shell shut nice and tight. So when the shell closes up, these teeth are going to line up with each other so that they perfectly fit and they help maintain a tight hold around each other so that it's hard to pry the shell open. So the lateral teeth will end up lining up with each other. And then you can see there's a gap right here on this side for the pseudocardinal teeth, where a large tooth up here ends up coming down and fits perfectly into this spot. Now, to help keep the shell shut, besides teeth, are going to be muscles. So you can see scars right here that are going to be where muscles used to be to help keep the shell shut overall. And you can see that there's additional scarring down here. So that's the paleo line. And all up in here is where the actual body of the freshwater mussel is going to be at, along with their foot that they use for movement. Now, freshwater mussels have a lot of diversity to their shape, and it's also very confusing because you can have one species of freshwater mussel that has two different looking forms to it. And this caused a lot of confusion for early biologists who were studying them, potentially thinking that they were separate species. But it turns out that freshwater mussels end up following form fits function, like we were talking about earlier in part 1 of this presentation. They follow it pretty well, even amongst species specifics. So when we look at this example here, we look at a Fuscinaia flava, and we're looking at two different forms. The first form, the top one right here, and then this side picture right here, this is going to be the small stream form. So this is a freshwater mussel that is going to be living in the smaller headwater streams that you'd be finding in the watershed. Now, these streams are going to have lower levels of water. And because of that, you don't want to be very big and bulky, where if the water levels drop, now suddenly you're exposed and outside of the water. That's a problem. Instead, you want to be kind of flattened out in shape and almost shaped like the head of a shovel. And the idea with that is, much like a shovel, you can end up digging down into the substrate so that you don't expose as much of your body to the water. So if water levels are dropping, you're able to stay submerged. So that's the idea with a smaller stream form of a mussel. Now, when it comes to larger streams, where you've got faster flowing waters and you've got big rocks that might be tumbling around because of the water current, you want to be big and bulky in shape so that your shell is really tough and you're not going to be moving around very easily on the bottom. So you're kind of shaped like a little anchor, and you're able to just stay nice, hunkered down to where you want to be at in the stream. So makes sense. These animals are going to be in the shape that they are able to best adapt for their environment. So smaller stream, you want to be shaped kind of like a shovel so you can dig down and not be as exposed to drying waters. And in big, large rivers, you want to be big and bulky so that rocks that might accidentally tumble onto you aren't as hard hitting, and you're able to stay in place. When we look at mussels in greater detail, we have an example right here of a rather fragile species. So this is an eastern floater. Their shell is kind of papery in texture and just kind of brittle. It's a very interesting texture when you feel it. And when you look along the edge of the margins here, you don't really see any teeth that are present. So this is a freshwater mussel that is going to be living in either like pond or lake habitats where there's not fast flowing waters that are running against it, or it's in like softer substrates like sand that it doesn't have to worry about rocks potentially falling onto it. Then we have the eastern lamp mussel right here. This is going to be a bit of a bulkier mussel. It's got a harder shell. And you can see down here that the lateral teeth and the pseudocardinal teeth are both present and very prominent in appearance, especially in comparison to what's going on over here on this eastern floater. So eastern lamp mussel is going to be found in areas where the water current is going to be faster and the rocks are going to be present in the stream and could potentially smack against the shell of the mussel. So just an example of how species of mussels are shaped and why. So freshwater mussels are going to be using their large muscular foot to move around and anchor themselves into the substrate. So it's a very, very slow process, as we'll see in a second. And this foot is going to be covered in mucus. So that way, as they're pushing their way through the substrate, they're not ending up damaging their foot on any like sharp rocks or other objects like that. And ultimately, when the mussel finds a place that it is like, okay, I'm good, I want to set up shop, they end up taking that foot and scooping out substrate below them until they dig down into the ground, and they use that foot as an anchor to keep themselves in place. And then they set up shop and start to filter feed. So here's a video. You're not going to hear any sound with this, but you'll be able to see just how slow of a process it is for a freshwater mussel to get its foot out of its shell and try to move itself just a few inches. So you can see slow and steady is winning the race when it comes to the life of a freshwater mussel. It takes them quite a bit of time just to get that foot fully extended and then to try and wrap it underneath of them just to shift their bodies slightly. So that's something very important to keep in mind for future parts of this presentation. So moving on, freshwater mussels filter feed through siphons. So they have two different types of siphons. They have an in-current siphon, which is the side siphon right here, and an X-current siphon that is up at the top. What freshwater mussels will do is that they will basically aim their bodies so that the in-current siphon is facing upstream and water is going to be flowing down, flows downstream and into the in-current siphon, where you'll have like pieces of organic particles, algae, bacteria, end up all going through the in-current siphon, and the freshwater mussel processes the food that way. So that's how they end up eating. And when the freshwater mussel produces waste, it ends up expelling it out through the X-current siphon up top, where it then floats downstream and is deposited elsewhere. Now, sometimes you can get like sand and other debris that ends up floating downstream and getting into the siphon. And what happens is the freshwater mussel will produce mucus and it will wrap up that debris, and then it will release it out from the X-current siphon. So here's an example of a freshwater mussel filter feeding. So water is going to be flowing into the X current siphon here, and then expelling waste from the X current siphon right here. So if you look down here, you can actually see a little caddisfly friend moving underneath of the freshwater mussel as it's filter feeding as well. Now, for me personally, one of the things that I really enjoy doing when I'm just out in nature in a stream is just kicking back and watching the freshwater mussels filter feed. It's a very calming, relaxing thing to observe. Maybe it's just me personally kind of thing. It's just one of those things where you just see something so simple occurring like that and just puts you at ease and peace. Highly recommend doing that one day. So with this filter feeding, a single adult freshwater mussel can filter up to 15 gallons of water per day. That is a lot of water for a tiny little living rock like that to be doing. So you can see an example fish tank after 24 hours of water without any freshwater mussels. You can see, well, you can't even see through the water. That's bad. But in this tank where you have freshwater mussels that have filter fed in here, look how clear and clean this water is in comparison. Just tremendous difference right there, and just extreme importance for what these animals do. Now, when it comes to freshwater mussels, I talked earlier, I said, there's a lot of diversity in freshwater mussels, and you can see, primary diversity down here towards the Mobile Basin of Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia area. Now, when you think about it though, look at how freshwater mussels have gotten all over the place in North America. Well, we just saw how slow it takes for a freshwater mussel to move around. How is a freshwater mussel going to be able to expand and colonize new habitat like that? I mean, sure, that's a long period of time to give it the opportunity to do that, but that's really pushing it for what is basically a living rock. So how can the freshwater mussel get past this obstacle? And the key thing for this is that it's all part of their life cycle. So freshwater mussels start life as parasitic larvae called Glaucidium or Glaucidia. Here you can see what they look like. They're kind of cute looking. Look like little butterflies, maybe. This one right here with it kind of looks like its mouth's open. Kind of looks like Pac-Man, munching its way through a maze. But then you start to look at them in greater detail and you realize, oh my God, these things are quite terrifying looking. They have little barbs that they end up biting down onto their host, and they basically suck their blood through this little tube here. So they're kind of look like little chain chomps that you would see in Super Mario games. So these are parasitic babies that are feeding primarily on fish hosts. Now, that brings up another problem. So, okay, we have our idea where we can attach the fish. That can help us get around. Fish swim all over the place. But how do we get a fish to come to us if we are a fee mama freshwater mussel that wants to have her babies infest fish? There's two primary ways. The first is using what are known as conglutinates to attract fish hosts. these are basically, think of them like sacs that are going to be filled with baby Glaucidia. Some of these will be shaped in ways that mimic other critters. So you've got something like this that looks like maybe like a really tiny fish or even an aquatic insect. So that looks like it might be tantalizing for a fish to eat. Ooh, this looks like it could be tasty too. You know, got little tails like that. Kind of reminds you a little bit of the two tails on a stonefly. Wow, look at this. You've got one that is being floated out into the water that's attached to this mucus strand right in here that's floating around. It kind of looks like a little fish that's in the water. And what will happen is you get fish like this little darter up here that sees the conglutinates and thinks, that's a nice tasty meal right there. I better bite down on it. And when they end up biting down, it ends up puncturing the conglutinate, which releases the baby mussels that are inside, and then they'll end up either attaching onto the gills of the fish or the fins of the fish. Other freshwater mussels are going to use lures that basically explode when they are bitten, which releases the Glaucidia in like a cloud of babies. So this is really fascinating because you have freshwater mussels that will mimic different animals. So these top two examples, these look like little fish that are going to be in the water. Down here, you've got what kind of looks like a little crayfish right here. You can see, looks like you got little eyes like that. And then right in here where the claws would be. And then this one kind of looks like a big old fat worm. That would be a nice tasty treat for most fish. And the crazy thing about these lures is it's not just like the mussel just sits there doing that. It's that they're able to wave these lures around so that they look like other animals that they're trying to mimic. So, for example, you have these small fish that are chilling on the bottom of the stream, these little darters. And what ends up happening is you've got your fee mama freshwater mussel right here, and she's waving her lure around, and it kind of looks like these fish that are just shifting around on the bottom like that. And that's going to cause a predator to see that and think, oh boy, a tasty treat. And then they bite on down, and that's when it explodes open and releases the baby Glaucidia, which gets sucked up by the fish and attaching to the gills or the fins of the fish that way. And here's another example. And you can really see basically that landmine portion right in here, that gray part. That's where all the babies are going to be hiding out. So fish comes in and strikes that and pops it like a bubble. And that's how your Glaucidia get spread out into the water. Here you can see some Glaucidia that are attached to the gills of the fish, and they'll stay on there and basically suck their blood. And same thing on the fins of the fish. And eventually the freshwater mussel grows big enough from sucking enough blood that it falls off of the fish and it ends up turning into a juvenile mussel and starts to filter feed. So when we bring this all together and look at this life cycle, we have our freshwater mussels that mate, and then we have our female that has her lure. She waves it around. You got a predatory fish that ends up biting down onto it. The babies are released and they'll attach to the gills of the fish. And then the fish ends up doing what fish do best and swimming around doing their fish things. And because of that, the freshwater mussel is able to be transported to different areas of the stream. And once the Glaucidia are big enough, they fall off of the fish, land into the substrate, and turn into regular old freshwater mussels that end up filter feeding. Now, this is how freshwater mussels managed to be able to conquer the problem of being living rocks. They were able to basically hitch rides on fishes to new stream systems. So if you have an event where you have two streams that are in completely different watersheds that end up connecting to each other through, say, like a catastrophic flooding event, where you get basically cross divides of the streams getting flooded over and streams connecting, you can have fish from either basin basically go the opposite direction and enter these new streams. And with them, they'll bring freshwater mussels along for the ride. So really, really cool stuff that's just mind-blowing when you think about it, especially when you realize this animal doesn't have eyes. How on earth did it evolve the ability to mimic fish and other critters like that? That is just crazy to think about. It's so fascinating and just incredible things with freshwater mussels. They are my second favorite group of animals. So why on earth should we care about freshwater mussels? So much like EPT that we were looking at before, the ephemeropterans, the plecopterans, and the trichopterans, freshwater mussels are very sensitive to poor water quality, especially sedimentation issues. So when it comes to the poor water quality, remember, they're filter feeders. So if you have pollutants that are flowing downstream in the water, the freshwater mussel is going to be siphoning in those pollutants and taking that in directly. So very bad right there and then, easily going to kill freshwater mussels. But then you have sedimentation. So sedimentation is when you have excess soil, sand, rock, and other material like that that is flowing into the stream, usually from stormwater runoff. And this can cause two primary problems. First, it can end up clogging up the holes and interstitial spacing that is underneath of rocks that animals use for habitat. So now they don't have a place to live. But the second thing that it does is to mussels, it will end up clogging up their siphons. So remember, they're able to adapt to some like sand and debris that's floating downstream. They can wrap it up in mucus, but sedimentation overloads the freshwater mussels. They can't end up filtering out all of that debris, and it basically shreds up their siphons and basically has a long, excruciating, painful death for the freshwater mussel. So very, very bad aspect with sedimentation. Now, freshwater mussels help keep our streams clean through their filter feeding. So, besides being indicators for poor water quality as well as sedimentation, they're also going to be keeping the streams normally pretty clean. They'll take care of algae and such that are happening in the streams. So we can have all of these water filtration plants and spend millions of dollars trying to clean up the water, but we also have natural filterers that live in the streams in the form of freshwater mussels. So if we have conditions that are right for freshwater mussels, they'll help filter water for us. So we can use a combination of both to help us out. We don't have to spend as much money on filtering water, and we can have just overall healthier environments that way. And then freshwater mussels are a food source for several animals. So like muskrats particularly will love to eat freshwater mussels. They'll take them and crack them over rocks. And usually you can tell if a muskrat is in an area because you'll see a bunch of scattered freshwater mussel shells around a nice pointed rock where they can break it open and eat the mussel inside. But then they'll also create habitat when they're living and deceased. So when they're living, you can have critters such as caddisflies and snails that are going to be crawling on them. And then when they're deceased, they'll end up usually opening up, and their shells can act as shelter for animals such as crayfish, fish. You can see we've got a snail hanging out on the shell as well. We've got a little crayfish friend hiding right in there. So overall, very important to stream ecosystems for freshwater environments. All right, the time has come for the best part of the presentation. That's right, it's time for the crayfish. Let's get excited. These are the best animals in freshwater ecosystems. So the freshwater crayfishes, we're going to be looking at Cambaridae. So Cambaridae are going to be all crayfishes that are going to be east of the Rocky Mountains in North America. So in my opinion, crayfish are the charismatic megafauna of freshwater ecosystems. So terrestrial ecosystems, we have things like pandas. Now, pandas are, cute and cuddly. They're fun. And some of them are really good at kung fu, but they're just not as great as the crayfish are. Crayfish can come in all of these fascinating colorations. And the best part is that when you're in a stream, you're able to take youth out into the stream and you can hook them easily with crayfish. So crayfish are very easy to handle for youth. Crayfish are fun to catch. They don't require a ton of effort to catch. They're pretty easy. You find the biggest crayfish under the biggest rock. So that teaches teamwork and encourages teamwork for lifting the largest rock together with your friends. And just overall, they have really fun, quirky personalities to them, and just very entertaining animals that will really do a great job of hooking people onto them. And then you can talk about all the other critters that are in the freshwater environment. So it is believed that crayfish diverged from their marine ancestors around the mid-Permian to mid-Triassic. So we've got fossil evidence of crayfish as well as their burrows. Now, this brings up an interesting question. How did crayfish come from a marine environment and work their way into a freshwater environment? What was that main driving force that allowed crayfish to evolve? And that involves their babies. So marine crustaceans, when their eggs hatch, their babies are going to be little planktonic babies. So they are floating in the ocean, floating around. They're not really getting swung all over the place or anything. There's no crazy water current. They're just living in the water column, doing their thing, and then eventually becoming adult crustaceans. The problem with this is if I'm in a freshwater ecosystem, so I'm a crayfish ancestor, and I'm working my way up into a stream that's nearby. if I have babies in this stream and they're planktonic, what's going to happen to them? They are going to basically get swept downstream into the ocean because water current is going to carry them all the way down river and down the stream. So that's a problem. How can you end up expanding out as a species when your babies are just going to get constantly swept back into the ocean and you're basically stuck where you're at? So it's more ideal for crayfish when their eggs hatch to basically be little versions of themselves. So crayfish in the adaptation to freshwater environments, their babies are like miniature versions of themselves. And what happens is when they hatch, they hitch a ride on the swimmerets on the tail of the female crayfish. Female crayfish are fantastic parents and will take care of their babies for quite an extended period of time. Eventually, the little baby crayfish grow big enough that they'll end up detaching from mom, and then they can run around doing normal crayfish things on the bottom of the stream. That is perfect because if I'm trying to expand my territory as a crayfish, my babies can just start from right where I had them and continue moving about and doing their thing. So similar thing happening with freshwater mussels. Instead of having the planktonic life stage, they evolved to have that parasitic life stage. So that's kind of going over some fun aspects when it comes to the transition of marine environments over to freshwater environments. Now, crayfish generally follow the same body plan. They have some alterations to them that are based on their lifestyle and habitat preferences. So here's a classic stream-dwelling crayfish species. There's 4 things that we're going to focus on. The first is the chelae, or the pincers. The second is the rostrum, or this head plate that's right between the eyes. The third is the areola, right in here, this space where the carapace rounds up on both sides, this opening. And then the cervical spine, which is located on the side here, where the head and the carapace round up and connect to each other there. So a stream-dwelling crayfish like this typically has more spines covering its body. So you can see it's got some spines on its arms. You've got some spines right here, and there's some spines on the tip of its rostrum, which right here is forming kind of like a trident appearance. So the idea with this is that if I am in a stream and I have a fish predator that tries to eat me, they're going to get a mouthful of spines. So that is why you have crayfish living in stream habitats covered in spines like that. Some crayfish are going to be very large and bulky in shape, and they generally prefer living under large slab boulders. So, for example, this crayfish, you can see, has some, spines and tubercles. So tubercles being little bumps that are going to be on the front of its body. Not quite as much, you don't see any cervical spines here. But if you look at the general shape of this crayfish, it's very bulky in shape, and it's flattened dorsal ventrally. So basically, this is flattened out like a pancake. The crayfish is like that because the habitat it prefers are large slab boulders, which are going to be really big, flat rocks. So that way it's able to tuck its way underneath of the rocks very easily and have a nice place to shelter in. Some crayfish have large gaps in their chelae that will help them cling to the substrate in faster waters. So we look at this crayfish right here, and we see that there's almost these gaps that are in the chelae kind of like if you took your hands and you formed a 0 or an O with them. So what happens is this crayfish is going to be in an area with faster water. Water is going to be flowing over its body, and water flows through these gaps. And these gaps are known as hydrofoils. So water flows through, and it causes the crayfish to be pinned down to the bottom of the stream. So that helps keep it in place instead of getting flung downstream by the faster water current. If you look closely on the rest of the body, you can see the crayfish is very, very smooth and doesn't really have a whole lot of spines. And even look at that rostrum. It's really thin and narrow in appearance, kind of looks like a spear or a lance head. So the less spines on the crayfish, that's less drag on the body from faster water currents. So this crayfish is perfectly adapted to living within the riffle habitat of streams. Crayfish with thin, streamlined bodies and chelae are going to be adapted for moving through aquatic vegetation. Perfect example is going to be the red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarki. This is an introduced species into Massachusetts, and it is extremely invasive. Many of you might have seen this already if you've ever eaten crayfish. So this is your typical Louisiana crawdad that everyone loves to eat. I can tell you right now that they are delicious. So this crayfish, when you look at it, it has a very thin body, and then its chelae are also very thin, so that when it's moving through aquatic vegetation, it's able to maneuver through thick, dense vegetation pretty much. So the leaves and stuff like that, it's able to wind its way through without any problem. So very key adaptation to living in like wetlands and ponds that are going to have a lot of vegetation. But then you have what's really cool are the burrowing crayfish. So several crayfish are adapted for digging complex tunnel systems. These crayfish typically don't live within the stream itself. Instead, they're either going to live up along the stream bank or completely away from a stream in like a wetland, a roadside ditch, something like that, that's going to have water available as a groundwater source. So these crayfish will dig really complex tunnels down into the ground and reach that groundwater source. That's how they're able to keep their gills wet, and essentially they move on land. So think of them kind of like a terrestrial animal. Now, because they're terrestrial animals, they're going to have slightly different characteristics compared to a stream-dwelling crayfish. The first is the vaulted carapace. What this means is where the carapace rounds up here, you can see that it's basically that areola, that space is obliterated or it is missing. So what happens with that is this causes the carapace to round up, and it causes it to be vaulted in shape. So think of it being taller and thinner because of that. So this allows the crayfish to have more surface areas for the gills to store water. Next up, you've got a smaller tail. So this is a crayfish that's not swimming in water. So it doesn't need to have a tail to help propel itself backwards from predators. So when it's moving on land, a larger tail is going to be dragging behind it. So you want something that's smaller and easier to be moving around on a terrestrial environment. And then they're going to have chelae that are shaped like little scoops, little shovels that they'll use to pick up clay and mud, and then they'll carry it with them and drop it off in a new area. When we look at a burrowing crayfish versus a stream-dwelling crayfish side by side, you can really see what I mean by that vaulted carapace. See how much taller and thinner this crayfish looks from that front point of view compared to the almost barrel shape of the stream-dwelling crayfish. So that's how different these critters end up looking because of that. And then some crayfish just have absolutely gorgeous colorations, though we're still not quite sure why that's the case. A lot of the burrowing species in particular have really, really cool colors, such as this is a Cambaridae. This is, as you can see, a blue crayfish. It is naturally blue like this. You know, you always see things in the news like a blue lobster was found. Well, the crayfish are just naturally blue for some species. So take that, lobsters. Now, it's weird because why would you be this color? If you're in a stream, you're just going to be super easy to see and a predator is going to eat you. Well, in a burrow, you know, you don't necessarily have to worry about that. And maybe these blue colors under certain light conditions make you harder to see. And then other crayfish will have certain parts of their bodies that are a little bit like a different color, like a bright orange, for example, compared to the rest of their body. And that could be a way to help attract mates when they're sitting at the front of their burrows. So the verdict is still out on what's going on with it, but those are some of the hypotheses that are being thrown around. So why should we care about crayfishes? Crayfish are considered keystone species. So other species depend on them, and if they're removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. So think of this like the keystone in an arch. So if I take out this keystone, the arch is pretty much going to fall apart. It doesn't have that key aspect that is holding it together. If we take the crayfish out of the stream ecosystem, a lot of stuff in the ecosystem is going to collapse around it because it plays such a pivotal role. So crayfish can end up digging burrows out from underneath of rocks and streams. So they'll create these shallow excavations underneath of rocks, and they'll hunker down in there. So you can see these are two spiny-cheeked crayfish down in the Quinnebog River. But then you'll have the burrowers that construct really complex tunnel systems. So these are going to be outside of water. So here's a field out in Missouri where you've got crayfish burrows. And look around. Do you see any water directly around these burrows? There's some out in there, but these crayfish are going to have tunnels that go all the way down into the ground and meet that groundwater source where they're able to keep their gills wet. So they're going to be little ecosystem engineers. And this is crazy to think about because you get these little mud chimneys that form. And these crayfish are making these mud chimneys for a reason. The theory is that they help control the humidity and temperature levels within the burrow. That's very, very cool. They're basically changing their environment to fit them like it's a little house. So not necessarily air conditioning setup, but kind of close for considering it's a little crustacean. Now, this is important because other animals are going to be using these burrows for shelter, which can be life-saving. So you have fish in the streams that are going to be hiding underneath and in crayfish burrows that are excavated under rocks. You'll get aquatic insects, snails, etc. All these animals that are going to be using these burrows for shelter within the stream. But then we also have the crayfish burrows that are on land. These burrows are extremely important primarily for amphibians, reptiles, and insects. So because I had mentioned before, they're humidity and temperature controlled, this is going to be a great place for something like an amphibian to have a place to hide and keep itself, wet and able to breathe and not dried out during really dry conditions. And this particular frog in the picture, this is a crawfish frog that is adapted to live primarily in crayfish burrows. And without the crayfish burrows, this frog is going to disappear because it has no habitat to be living in. But then you'll have other animals like the eastern Massasauga, which is a rattlesnake species. They will end up going down into the burrows during the wintertime and basically sheltering down there for the winter. So they provide really key habitat for a lot of animals. And without them, these animals are going to perish. They don't have that protection. And then the other most important thing about crayfish is that they are the literal garbage disposals of the stream. They will eat virtually anything they can get their little chelae on. So just as an example, the crayfish will eat aquatic insects, and the aquatic insects eat leaves, periphyton, algae, plants, etc. But then the crayfish will also eat leaves and periphyton, plants and algae, etc. So crayfish can control what's going on with both indirect and direct feeding on these different food sources. So indirectly through feeding on insects and directly through feeding on the food source itself. So they can really help shape the freshwater ecosystem that way. But then they're also critically important because they'll help recycle nutrients from, say, dead animals. So if a fish dies and falls to the bottom, the crayfish are going to help clean that up, and they're going to convert that into animal protein. So that way, that passes energy back up into the food chain. So key thing going on here with eating bugs and the algae and rotting leaves. So this is creating a higher form of energy that can help travel up the food chain. Because crayfish eat so many different things, they play that really important role in the food chain. And then everyone also loves to eat crayfish. Many animals eat crayfish. So you can have mink that will end up catching crayfish and eating them. You'll have fish. Bass love to eat crayfish. So they're going to be feasting on crayfish. It's going to play a big part of their diet. Birds will eat them, like great blue herons will end up eating them. Other crayfish will eat crayfish. Crayfish are definitely cannibalistic. So, and it's just, they play such a big role in the ecosystem, and even humans, such as crayfish biologists, will end up eating crayfish because they're just so delicious. And for humans, because of that, they end up playing either part of our diet, but also they play a role for the economy as a source of income for many people. All right, so here's kind of like an interactive part for the audience. So basically, this is similar to what we did in the first presentation. And the idea here is I will put a picture up on screen, and it's going to be a multiple choice question associated with the picture. So it'll be picture, question, and then 3 letters that you can pick from with answers. And what you'll do is you'll just type it into the chat what you think it is, and we'll check and see what you think it is. So, first one. We have a nice stream with quite a bit of rocky waters in there. So, what kind of mussel would live here? Would it be a mussel with a thin shell and reduced teeth? Or is it going to have a thick shell with large teeth? So remember, the habitat is going to be this stream that has quite fast waters and rocks in it. So we'll just give it 1 second. So far we got B. And another B. Excellent. You are correct. So this is going to be perfect habitat for a freshwater mussel that's going to have a thick shell to help protect it from falling rocks and large teeth that will end up helping the shell stay nice, tight, and closed. Perfect. Great job. All right. Next one. What are baby mussels called? Type it into the chat. Are they subimagos? Are they glochidia? Or are they conglutinates? So specifically the baby mussel itself that you see up here. Is this a subimago, a glochidia, or glochidium? Or is this a conglutinate? It could count as a new Scrabble word. You will probably dumbfound everyone who comes across this. So looks like might be struggling a little bit. It's all good. Okay. So this one is going to be glochidia. So B. So remember, the glochidia are going to be the baby mussels themselves. They look like the little Pac-Man or the chain chomps from Super Mario, while the conglutinates are going to be those little lures that are set out that are separate from the mussel that look like, you know, a little insect or a tiny little fish that is filled with the glochidia. So that's a tough one to remember. So no worries on that. All right. Now we have a crayfish. Where does this crayfish live? So we can see really slender claws and a slender body. So does this crayfish live in fast currents, vegetation, or deep burrows? And yes, conglutinates will precede the glochidia in the life cycle. So where does this crayfish live? So we got one answer saying fast currents, and we got another answer saying vegetation. So the answer for this one is vegetation. And the reason that this crayfish is found in vegetation, you can see, look at those really thin chelae up here, along with that really thin body. So this crayfish is going to be adapted for moving through that thick thing of aquatic vegetation. All right, next up. Oh, crayfish are delicious. I haven't had freshwater mussels, but so where does this crayfish live? So, you know, pretty smooth looking crayfish. And it looks like we have gaps in the chelae. So is this crayfish living in fast currents, vegetation, or in deep burrows? So pretty smooth along the body. And then we've got these gaps or the hydrofoils. So we've got an answer for fast currents. All right, so pretty unanimous. Everyone thinks that it's fast currents. And that is correct. This crayfish is found in the faster currents of the stream because it has a very smooth body, and you've got the hydrofoils that are present for when water rushes over their body. It helps pin them down to the bottom. Good stuff. And then our last one, where does this crayfish live? So, does this one live in fast currents, vegetation, or deep burrows? So look at the body. Do we see an areola right here? I don't see one. And then we've got these big shovel-like chelae up here. And yes, you are correct. It is the deep burrows. And we already did the other two, but you never know. You could throw in one that throws people off. So that sometimes gets people on tests that they take. So fantastic job, everyone. So just some quick conclusions for what we learned through these past sessions. So freshwater invertebrates are incredible organisms with massive diversity. They are just driven by adaptations to their environment. Whether, you got a burrowing mayfly here with their tusks, and then you've got a nice Quinnebog river crayfish, which is a crayfish that is endemic to the Massachusetts area. And then they play an incredibly important role in the transfer of energy throughout both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So you have the mayflies, for example, that are going to be moving from aquatic to terrestrial environments as immature nymphs into the adult imago. So something like a trout is going to be able to feed on both, but the adults will also be fed on by birds and spiders, while the larvae, the nymphs end up getting fed on by fish, crayfish, etc. And then you have something like the freshwater mussels, where you've got the muskrat that ends up prying open the shell and eating the freshwater mussel on land. And then each group plays an important role in North America's freshwater ecosystems, whether it's breaking down leaves, filtering water, or creating habitat for other animals. So they all play an important role, and it's important to make sure that we conserve these animals for the next generations to come, to appreciate their beauty and just overall really cool aspects to their life history and adaptations. So really quick, here's some useful resources. So some really good websites. So Macroinvertebrates.org, fantastic online key for looking through pictures of aquatic invertebrates. These are fantastic for aquatic insects and will be really, really great for teaching people how to identify bugs. Stroud Water Research Center in general. This is down in Pennsylvania, where I am from. They have just amazing resources. They have different apps, all kinds of cool things for macroinvertebrates. Then I also attached an atlas of the crayfishes of Connecticut. This is really great for helping you identify most of the Massachusetts species, so that's a good resource. And then Model My Watershed is a great website for looking at details about your local watershed. So just great resources overall with these 4 different websites. Excuse me. And then, the typical miscellaneous, like, I don't own all of these pictures. Some of them are my own, but for those that are not, I give full credit to those people. Here's my contact information for anyone who'd want to reach out to me with any questions on crayfish and other freshwater macroinvertebrates. And then with that, any questions?
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was really cool.
No problem. You can tell that I love talking about this stuff.
Absolutely. You're very enthusiastic about it.
Thank you.
I don't think I have any questions right now. Andy, do you have any questions that you'd like Patrick to answer?
I don't, but that was absolutely wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I learned, I don't know how much is going to stick, but lots and lots of new information for me. This is, the aquatic environment is not my forte. So this is, and the photos, whether they're yours or someone else's, they're fantastic. This end one is adorable.
This one is mine.
Yeah, it's great. Looking right at you. So what is it? Can I just ask a sort of peripheral question?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what is your background?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have a really interesting sort of story in that regard. When I was in high school, I was kind of torn between whether I wanted to do conservation, and work with animals, or if I wanted to go into music. I really loved playing bass clarinet in particular, but I ultimately decided to go with conservation and biology. Steve Irwin was my primary influencer when it comes to that. I love Steve Irwin so much, and he was a blessing to have in my life. And I went to undergrad at Delaware Valley University in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm from southeastern Pennsylvania, and it's basically like a farm school, but it has a lot of great biology and conservation-based programming there. And I started off as a biology major, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do. Initially, I wanted to work with spotted hyenas, and then that shifted over. I decided to change majors to conservation and wildlife management, just to hone in a little bit more on the conservation aspect of things and take courses that were more relevant to my interests. And one of the things that my university required was 500 hours of work experience in order to graduate. And that was experience in our field. So I needed to get some hours in, and I was looking around for different opportunities before looking at internships for further down the road. And I came across, because at that point I was like, I kind of want to do invasive species work. It seems like a good way to make a living. And I came across Valley Forge National Historical Park, which is local national park in my area.
I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm familiar with
it. Yeah, nice.
I did archaeology there as a student. So
that's so cool. Did you work at the Academy of Natural Sciences?
But I never worked there. As a kid, I used to take the train into the city and go to classes there all the time. I love that place.
Oh, that's
by the
so
time
cool.
I was old enough to work there, I had moved out of town. But anyway, you finish your story. I apologize for interrupting.
No, that's great to hear. It's so that's cool that you'll get some of the aspects of this then. So I ended up I did some volunteer work at Valley Forge. They had a program to remove rusty crayfish from Valley Creek. Rusty crayfish are also an invasive species up here in Massachusetts. So I went in and helped out, and oh my God, it felt like I was a kid again. I was in the stream, flipping rocks, having just a wonderful time. And I used to catch crayfish all the time as a kid. And I was like, this is great. I wonder if I could do a research project on crayfish and get some more hours in for my 500 hours. So I ended up doing a research project on crayfish, thanks to my university having that opportunity. And then, I knew during that project that that this is probably where I was going to end up like sticking, like the animal I was going to stick with, because I found 2 blue crayfish, not normally blue crayfish. So 2 blue color morphs of crayfish during that project. And that's pretty uncommon. That's more along the lines of what you would see with like lobsters being blue. So I ended up getting an internship at Valley Forge doing surprise crayfish stuff. And I found 2 additional invasive crayfish in the park. And things kind of snowballed really, really hard from that point. I graduated in 2013 with my undergrad, and I immediately hopped onto a plane out to Illinois, and I was working as a crayfish field technician for Dr. Christopher Taylor, who is one of the nation's top crayfish biologists or asticologists. And I worked for his grad student, Brian Engelbert, who's just fantastic guy. He was really fun to work with. And it was at that point when I was like, okay, it's official. I'm hooked on crayfish. I want to work in academia as a professor and be like Dr. Taylor and have a crayfish lab and a crayfish museum and just all of this cool stuff. So I realized at that point, though, that I wasn't quite mature enough for grad school, though. So I took some time off and I worked seasonal at Valley Forge. So 6 months out of the year, I'd be there. And then the other 6 months, I'd be working retail at PetSmart and Asics, the shoe brand. And so I basically juggled 3 jobs for about 4 to 5 years. And I took the Secretary of the Interior out to catch crayfish in 2017, I believe that was. And to put it in perspective, the only person within the federal government that I could take up higher than that would basically be the President of the United States. So at that point, it was like, you know, it's time to move on and go to grad school. I've officially climbed up the mountain and I'm at the peak. And I reached out to Dr. Loafman, Dr. Zachary Loafman from Wesley University in West Virginia. And I entered into his lab and I did a whole bunch of crayfish work in Western Pennsylvania, primarily working with a little orange crayfish that burrows into the ground, the upland burrowing crayfish, and then the Lake Erie Basin of Pennsylvania. And through my graduate experience, I am essentially now one of Pennsylvania's 3 crayfish experts. And it's just crazy because I went from being a volunteer, not necessarily sure what I wanted to do, starting off in a program that just does, you know, little things, that does like some crayfish removal and stuff like that. And just, it snowballed so hard that I became an expert in the field. And right now I am kind of on like a little bit of a break from academia. COVID kind of messed everything up. And I'm trying to, fingers crossed, I've applied for a PhD position. And if everything works out, I will be hopefully getting into a PhD program in the fall where I'd be working with, surprise, crayfish.
Good luck.
Thank you. Yeah, my ultimate goal in life is to be a crayfish biologist working in academia. And I want to be able to, you know, one of the problems with being in academia is that you can get easily separated from like the local communities of the area. And you're never going to get people to care about the animal that you're studying unless you get out there and show them how cool the animals are. So my ultimate goal is that my lab will have a big focus on public outreach. It's really part of my passion. I really, really love taking groups of people out to catch crayfish, which, by the way, for any Mass Envirothon groups, if you are interested, I'd be more than happy during the spring and summertime to take students out into the stream and catch crayfish and other critters with you. So yeah, it's been one heck of a journey, and I wouldn't change anything at all.
What a great ambassador for invertebrates in general and crayfish in particular. But you're absolutely right. If people don't experience these things, they don't even know they exist. Mm-hmm. Let alone I mean, I love crayfish now. You just made me do that.
Thank you. It's just, there's such wonderful little critters. And I'll tell you, when you have a young child that's out in the stream that has never held a crayfish before, and they see it and they are terrified of it. And by the end, you slowly work with them, and you hold the crayfish and you say, well, just touch the crayfish on the tail. And, they pet the crayfish. It's like, okay, working up, building up confidence. And then by the end, they're holding a crayfish, walking around, showing it off to everyone. Just watching that growth within youth. Oh, you can't beat that feeling as an educator. It is really wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. It is. Thank you so much, Patrick.
No problem.
I don't know how many people are actually on right now listening to this, but
thank you so much for doing this, and I'll get the recording up so that even more people can enjoy it in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. This is a blast, and I'll be happy to do any other presentations. I can do deeper dives into crayfish, etc. So whatever is up in the air.
We got to figure out how to do a field session.
Once the streams definitely
thaw out here. Awesome. All right.